Hello and welcome to Grand Round Urology. I'm Mark Painter, and today we're continuing our series on Part D Medicare changes. And today I'm joined by Dr. Neal Shore and Dr. David Morris, two experienced Grand Round Urology participants. And we're going to move a little bit further into this and talk a little bit more about the physician perspective and the impacts to both the office and the patient for this new program. Just as a quick reminder, and I'd encourage you to find out a little bit more about the Part D, you refer to the other Ground Round Urology recording that we made earlier, which goes into a little bit more detail. But just as a highlight reminder that for 2025, we're moving in Part D from a maximum out of pocket of $3,500 down to $2,000 for 2025. And that the patients now have a new option called the smoothing option or the Medicare Prescription Payment Plan, the M3P, that does change the responsibility of copay to a little bit different model in that the patient actually gets to pay their copay equally over the months that they're enrolled in the program. And the office will not have to collect the copay for the majority of their drugs for that particular program. And that the low-income subsidy patients probably are not going to fit well into this M3P program. And then finally, a quick reminder again that ultimately, if a patient is going to be enrolled in this program, they either need to do it during the enrollment period, which is now through December 7th. So we're October 21st today. And then if there is an option for those patients to opt in any month throughout the year in 2025, so if you have a new patient that starts a drug, they'll be able to opt into this program. But it is a requirement that the patient actually opt into the program. Otherwise, they'll stay on the existing program in which they're responsible for the out-of-pockets up front. So finally, we've got a little bit of an execution issue in that it is up to the pharmacies and the in-office dispensers to actually educate the patient a little bit on this program. Now, there are some restrictions of how far they can go, and it is going to basically require that you make the patients aware of this, but the patient's really going to have to interact with their Part D plan to figure out how to execute this. So it is a little bit up to the patient overall to do this. So we are going to now, just for that quick reminder, I'm going to go into asking Dr. Shore and Dr. Morris a few questions about kind of where they are in this process. So first, I want to start off and ask both of you, do you currently have in-office dispensing programs in your practice?
So
Yes.
I'll maybe start. So we do. I know Dr. Morris does as well, and it's a really nice value-added benefit for patients because a lot of these drugs that we offer, they're oncologic drugs, and having an in-office dispensary and having somebody there not only to provide the clinical education, but also, as you're pointing out, Mark, there's a complexity to the financial reimbursement, which is sometimes remarkably daunting. And so I think we're both fortunate to have someone there to help with that. And this is really, goes the whole larger picture of Medicare complexity and how it's always changing. So I think a program like this is really helpful because it maybe bring to attention to some of our other physician colleagues to start talking to patients before they even get to the dispensary to know about the MPPP so that they can at least know they have an opportunity to change and sign up for it now, but they can, of course, later on sign up in 2025.
Yeah. Very good. And do either of you have programs in place now to actually make your patients aware of this, or are you making patients aware of this option?
I think that anyone who's prescribing these drugs probably has a financial discussion with almost every patient. And whether we're dispensing or they're getting through a specialty mail order connected with their Medicare Plan Part D that comes directly to them, finances is a concern for every patient. And so to be able to say like next year is going to be better than this year, and this year was better than last year, it provides some hope to patients that are new to the process that this is not going to be financially crippling to them in terms of out-of-pocket cost. Now that's the government plan. We'll see what really happens, but I mean, I think the caps are real. It's just the idea of how it's going to roll out in January. Nobody's really aware of what's going to happen at the pharmacy level when you're actually handing the prescription to a patient. But it's heartening for the patients to hear it will be cheaper for them next year than it is this year. And it affects not just their cancer drugs, but all the oral drugs that get dispensed through the pharmacy that are under their Part D coverage. So we've been educating patients that next year they may have a smoothing option where instead of paying one lump sum, they pay it out over the year in installments. For new starts, we've actually been telling some people if you can't get a grant now, you may wait and start at the beginning of January because it may be financially tenable for you then, but it's not now. So we're educating from the physician side, but I think the IOD is providing tear sheets and warning patients about open enrollment so that they know to investigate their options on either keeping it as it is with the deductible up front before it kicks in or doing the smoothing option.
Excellent. And I thought I'd ask maybe more from the practice side of the equation. As you deal with patients and their deductibles and that funding, I mean, that's a lift for the practice. Is that something that you guys, or that the practice overall takes a little bit of time to discuss and monitor with the financial aspects of this addition to the patient's care?
Well, first, I think David Morris, does an exceptional job. I think he's in the minority of physicians who practice as a center of excellence in advanced cancer care, that he really is very, very good at having this conversation. And I don't mean to sound negative. I think a lot of physicians are maybe more like me. I spend a ton of time on the clinical decision making, and then I tend to punt it to this team that you're alluding to. So I have multiple people who are doing this and going through all these financial considerations, including our in-house pharmacist, as well as multiple key administrators. It's a heavy lift, but it's really important, right? Because we're all wanting patients to get optimal care, and we don't want them to have, economic toxicity, let alone, adverse events from therapies. But I think what David is a really great model for more and more physicians to recognize, to get that conversation. It's another part of the clinical decision-making, but the financial decision-making. And it's a challenge because it does take time. It does take a lot of resources of non-physicians as well as the folks who are running our IODs.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things that I hear about as I jump around the country talking to different groups is the amount of time and basically the heroic lift of some of the personnel within the practices to chase down those grants and funding process. And Dr. Morris, I'm kind of curious to hear a little bit about kind of how your group does that.
So we have as he mentioned, that the team, as any of us who trained at Michigan would say, it is the behind the scenes staff, that the farm techs that do a lot of grant acquisition. It makes it sound good that I can warn somebody, but that's no different than they do all the actual work to get it done, which is doing the applications, working through the financial documents that are required for some of these programs that is very scary for an elderly patient population. So that's the benefit that a private institution, and why we would have it, is that we can hand walk patients through that process versus a phone call from out of state or out of country to help from some of the mail order pharmacy setup. So I think if we're going to dispense, we need to do that, because that's the real value add for us to our patients, is to be able to say, we're going to get you through this process, because almost no one can get the medication without some form of help. And the reality is this will change, not only for our dispensing, but for patients being able to potentially get other drugs that are going to be cheaper. Some overactive bladder medications are very expensive. And so I think patients will see a benefit, not just the oncology patients, but we really won't know what happens with this until we get a few months into 2025, I'm afraid.
Yeah. And and I'm curious as to what you're thinking that the funds or the grants that they're put out there, how's the reaction going to be from that from those from those industry partners that actually fund those as we see these changes rolling through, if they actually roll through in the way they're expected.
Well, the funds and the grant application process is just so fascinating, and I think that's a positive spin on it. They open up, we're never really sure when they're opening up, and then it's a sort of I think of it as a mix of musical chairs and speed dating, because suddenly everybody's running to where to get the assistance for all of our patients who are enormously in need, and then it just stops. And I'm certainly optimistic that the pharmacy support for the grants and the funds will. I'm cautiously optimistic, but I hope that this continues to maintain, ideally burgeon, because there's a lot of need for this. In addition to, I think this MPPP, I think this is a really great advance for our patients, and if it goes as planned, as David mentioned earlier, and you have too, Mark. But we're still going to need the grants and the funding. We need to, it's really heart-wrenching when you can't get, quality, appropriate, evidence-based drug to patients, and there's just an economic deficit or an economic toxicity. So I'm cautiously optimistic.
Yeah. Very good. Well, and along that same lines, like you've both mentioned that the financial burden on the patient is key in treating the patient. I mean, and it has been for a long time as we've gone through this process. So I'm curious as to how do you guys actually work with the patients directly as it pertains to what their financial situations are and what your recommendations are to treat them?
Well, that's a tough question, because I think as clinicians, we love to stay above the fray, so to speak, that we're making recommendations that regardless of ability to pay. But we're not in a VA health system for most of us out in the real world. And so that is it's almost like the addendum to the novel that unfortunately is just as important as the entire novel, that we then have to say, like, that's great. Here's our great clinical recommendation. Neal spent forever talking to the patient about, here's why we're going to put you on this medicine. And then we say, oh yeah, one more thing. We actually have to make sure that you can afford this medicine. So that's been one of the real drawbacks to all of our great advances, is that they all have cost. And so this is one step closer to equity for all. Honestly, if you can say you can spend $150 a month and then have access to any oral medication under your Part D plan, that's great. It takes away some of our anxiety about them being able to pay for the medicines that we recommend. So if this works like it's supposed to, I'm very hopeful that if I have a new start on somebody in April of next year and they elected smoothing because they're on an antithrombotic agent that's expensive, there's a chance that I send them right up to the pharmacy and they just get their bottle because they don't have any out-of-pocket exposure. That's what I'm hoping. We'll see if it works.
Yeah, that's
Agreed.
exactly right. I think that's the real huge advance from the current administration, that this got, approved by Congress. I'm optimistic. And just as another thing that both David and I do in our clinics, is this why we have clinical trials set up. Because oftentimes patients can get a lot of therapy, cutting edge therapy, new therapies that may be even better, and are oftentimes without any cost whatsoever. So that just a little plug and pitch for the importance of clinical trials research.
Yeah. Yeah. I tell you, it's the marketplace has not held still as far as adding complexity across the board, and it is nice to see something that is moving. I think, like apparently you guys do too, in the right direction to making healthcare more accessible for those folks that really need it. Um, so, well, I think we'll wrap this up today as to where we are, and Maybe we'll revisit this next year as we start to see the rollout and the implementation of this program, but would encourage all of you, as Dr. Morris is and Dr. Shore's practices as well, to really educate your patients about this particular option as they go through the process of navigating treatment within our system. So remember, we've got that open enrollment period from October 15th until December 7th. Certainly would benefit, I think, a lot of our urologic patients, not just with urology, but their overall health care. Thank you.